Dear friends, these days the buzzword among the people, especially the academicians, thinkers, writers, educationists, heads of the schools, etc., is NEP 2020. And this NEP 2020 was declared on 29th of July 2020 after the cabinet approval by the MHRD minister. Today the MHRD is known as Education Ministry. This policy has suggested that change, and that change is already notified by the President of India. Now this education policy, to understand, we must understand the structure of this education policy 2020. This has four parts. The first one is on school education, part 2 is on higher education, part 3 on key areas of focus, and part 4 is making it happen. And the school education itself has almost 8 chapters, and the first chapter of the school education talks about early childhood care and education, the foundation of learning. Chapter 2 talks about foundational literacy and numeracy, an urgent and necessary prerequisite to learning. Chapter 3 talks about curtailing dropout rates and ensuring universal access to education at all levels. And chapter 4 talks about curriculum and pedagogy in schools. Learning should be holistic, integrated, enjoyable and engaging. This chapter is quite elaborate in detail. Chapter 5 talks about teachers, very significant for all our teachers and administrators to know what the changes that are proposed by this on teachers, teacher education, and also continued continued professional empowerment, etc. Chapter 6 talks about equitable and inclusive education, learning for all. And chapter 7 talks about efficient resourcing and effective governance through school complexes and clusters. And chapter 8 talks about standard setting and accreditation for school education. So this is the structure, and today I will be highlighting a few points and some concerns about the efficient resourcing and effective governance through school complexes or school clusters they call. Remember, this education, the complex idea was given by first Education Commission itself in 68 by Kothari Commission. And now when it comes to the new education policy 2020, Chapter 7, I would like to look at this new education policy in terms of Chapter 7, which talks about, this is the new education policy, 65-page document. In that document, 7th chapter is only dedicated to school complexes. And it talks about, I just read 2 extracts for your information, that it talks about school complexes, why, the rationale behind the school complexes. And it talks 7.1, it tells, while the establishment of primary schools in every habitation across the country, driven by the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, that is SSA, which we all call, now subsumed under the Samagra Shiksha scheme, and other important efforts across the states, has helped to ensure near universal access to primary schools. It has also led to the development of numerous very small schools. According to DISE 2016-2017 data, nearly 28% of India's public primary schools and 14.8% of India's upper primary schools have less than 30 students. The average number of students per grade in the elementary schooling system, that is primary and upper primary, that is grade 1 to 8, is about 14. And a notable proportion having below 6. During the year 16-17, there were 108,017 single teacher schools. The majority of them, that is 85,743, being primary schools serving class 1 to 5. So it is an abysmal situation we have. The schools in the villages or the rural belt or wherever this is mentioned, these schools have only 30 students and one teacher. Lakh of CC 1,08,017 schools are only one teacher schools in India. So this is the reality. Number 2, it talks about 7.2. It tells these small school sizes have rendered it economically suboptimal and operationally complex to run good schools. In terms of development of teachers as well as the provision of critical physical resources. Teachers often teach multiple grades at a time and teach multiple subjects, including subjects in which they have no prior background. Key areas such as music, arts and sports are often too simply not taught, and physical resources such as lab and sports equipment and library books are simply not available across schools. So the commission, in fact the policy rightly identify the what is lacking in our schools. It is interesting to note that many things are brought out by the policy, but it is not clearly analyzing what went wrong, what actually went wrong in the government schools. So without understanding that, proposing a new structure called school complexes, how viable it is, how effective it is yet to be seen. And therefore the policy talks about school can be organized into complexes or clusters, which will be the basic unit of governance and ensure availability of all resources, including infrastructure, academic libraries, and strong professional teacher community. Now, to understand the school complexes, it is interesting to note that school complexes actually has school complexes have 6 important areas to fulfill. Number 1, according to the commission, is a sharing of resources. That is, enable sharing of human and infrastructural resources. That means the expert teachers of a particular the leading cluster school must provide expertise of their resources, both men and also material. Now this includes the laboratories, libraries, playgrounds, classrooms, smart classes, and also the good teachers this particular school has must be able to available for other schools also. This is called sharing of resources mean. And the cluster of schools, you must understand, it is about a school which has the facilities, the infrastructure, the better expertise, etc., will be connected with many other schools which are less privileged, without having much of infrastructure. Perhaps one teacher schools, etc., can be connected to this school, and they will be considered as one cluster on one complex. Idea is very good. It was suggested in 1968, the first Education Commission itself, and in 86 policy also talks about school complexes. Now the first part is, as I said, sharing of resources. Number 2 is sharing of efficiency. The efficient expedition and resources for schools through building school complexes. So suppose the schools in 5 kilometers radius, there are schools which do not have many facilities like infrastructure facilities especially. They can be clustered together, and this school will be catering to the needs of the weaker schools also. And it also gives another important aspect for the school complexes to look into is planning. It talks about development of short-term and long-term plans, planning for education, planning for academic programs, planning for sports and arts and youth festival, etc. That is what the planning mean. And according to if, for example, teachers training, one teacher alone in a school cannot do much. So therefore, coming together and training, etc., is important. And another area of the school complex the government says is governance. Effective governance of schools will be done through school complexes, etc. This is again one has to wait and see. Integration of many things, that is itself also better integration of education across all levels through connected schools, and shared teachers and resources will take place through school complexes that will enable in turn both. So if there is a good practices in one school, or a very innovative way of teaching is done in particular school, that can be shared among this particular complex, which is called, is kind of a family of schools, we can say that way. And the last but very important aspect which we must notice is planning, pairing of schools. That means there is intertwining of schools. It talks about twining of government and private schools. It talks about chapter 7 or 10, it talks about twining of schools. I'll just read what it says. It says, to further enhance cooperation and positive synergy among schools, including between public and private schools, the twining, pairing of one public school with one private school will be adopted across the country, so that such paired schools may meet, interact with each other, learn from each other, and also share resources if possible. Best practices of private schools will be documented, shared, and institutionalized in public schools, and vice versa where possible. Now, ideally, these are all fantastic. School complex idea is no way one can deny. But then we must understand also the practicality of it. Nothing happens in vacuum. What's happening in the socio-political, cultural situation of India, we must place this idea of school complex and see how workable it is. Especially when it comes to pairing of schools, which is suggested. Now, in addition to this, we must understand, earlier itself the government has said, when it talks about the administration, etc., and accreditation, administration, assessment, etc., when it talked very clearly that public and private schools will be assessed with the same criterion. If so, the administration and the accreditation, etc., not administration, the accreditation and assessment will be done by the same criterion of the same agency, which is totally under the control of the government. And that agency may ask the school complex to get the private schools on board, and private schools includes the minority right schools. Now, the resources of the government schools, the salary paid by the government, and also the infrastructure supposed to be built by the government, etc., are not of the private schools. The minority schools, especially with the struggling with their resources and putting the entire thing into the schools and developing the schools infrastructure, maintaining so well, etc., that's why they have the resources, that's why they have the infrastructure. So now, with intertwining with this, or twining with, or pairing with the schools, it can adversely affect these well-existing, well-managed schools, unless the government gives them also aid and help. Now, and also we know the socio-cultural and political, as I said, the nuances that are existing in the society. There are also animosities and antagonism against communities, and this may increase through the school complex situation, because the people may be targeting the private schools. They wanted to utilize that facility anytime they may enter, anytime they may come in, and so on. There are all these nuances that has not mentioned in the policy. School complex idea is fantastic. If it is only for government schools, there is no problem. That is a must, and 68 onwards the government is saying same the policy has suggested. No government has done. Do you think that overnight it will change in this suddenly because of this policy? The ground realities are different, and therefore this apprehension. Now, when we look at this school complex, another aspect of it is that it has two other aspects which is mentioned in the policy. I think the first one is, it says about strengthening and setting up a Bal Bhavan for its school children of all age groups to partake in art related and career related and play related activities in the school complexes. And suppose the children, as the first 7.1 of the policy talks about, there are only 30 students and average students will be 14 in a school, etc. That means that school has to be closed down. It will be attached to the school complex system. That place of the government and the place of the school will be used as Bal Bhavans according to the suggestion. That also depending upon what kind of a committee, who is going to monitor, what kind of a village setup, what is the political ideology which is going to be infiltrated into, etc. Irrespective of political parties, which party rules, accordingly they will go into influence the people and infiltrate the ideology into the masses, especially the young minds. And it also talks about Samajik Chetana Kendras, which in my opinion again must be looked at cautiously. It talks about Samajik Chetana Kendras, unutilized capacity of schools to be used as Samajik Chetana Kendras to promote social, intellectual and voluntary activities. It also sounds very good. We all had, when we were all children, I remember in Kerala, we had beautiful village clubs and so on. Various groups come out with the clubs, Jawaharlal Nehru Art and Science Club, etc., etc. There were so many of the libraries were there in every village, etc. But situation has changed today with the political overtones in every area. This Samajik Chetana Kendras in the villages also can be turn out to be centers of training children into particular ideology. It can happen irrespective of the parties which in power. That is why these kinds of things can lead to problems, unless, I am not telling that everything is bad, no, unless the government makes it very, very flexible, and government must make it completely objective, not subjective in nature, and also implementation must be accepting the diversity of people, diversity of culture and caste and groups, etc. Now, as minority schools, I just say this much, that since the policy does not talk about minority rights, which is a constitutional rights given to the minorities of India to establish and administer the education institutions, that has not come into this policy. That is why the ideas like school complexes is going to be more complex for the minorities of India. I am sure that ideally it is very good school complexes and clusters that must be done. And in fact, if you look at our own schools, in many places we are already doing it. In Meghalaya, I visited some places where we have almost 30 government schools and a Jesuit school is tied up each other, and we are learning each other and giving our best to the schools. We also have, among the Jesuit schools, we have a practice of, we hold hand holding of our schools. That is, one of city schools which has resources and expertise will help our village schools to come up, to empower their teaching and learning facilities better way, and also providing resources to the village schools, etc. So this idea is not new for us, it has been done, but the problem now in this is training of private schools and government schools, because it is going to be administered or accredited, etc., by the same agency, the criterion will be same, etc. That means there are a lot of doubts, and yet we need yet better clarification. Otherwise, the school complexes is good, and it will hopefully empower our school system in the coming days. School complex idea from 68 onwards it is there, as I said, but government must seriously look into why that has failed so far in India, and that will be the first thing for getting a clarity and executing this school complex idea in the coming days. Thank you very much, and God bless all of us.